The consequences of a long-range NATO missile attack from Ukraine against Russia. The notion that a few long-range missiles from Ukraine, supplied or supported by NATO, would bring Russia to its knees is not only absurd but dangerously naive. This type of thinking reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of global power dynamics and the gravity of such a provocation. Leaders like the Danish Prime Minister might as well don their helmets, like France's Emmanuel Macron, and rush to the front lines if they genuinely believe in the fantasy of Russia's quick defeat. In reality, such an attack would not lead to the capitulation of Russia, nor would it result in a decisive NATO victory. Instead, it would ignite a chain of catastrophic consequences that could lead the world down the path of nuclear war, potentially erasing much of humanity in the process. Misguided belief in the power of a missile strike. The idea that long-range missiles could force Russia into submission fundamentally underestimates the resilience and military strength of the Russian state. Throughout history, Russia has demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for survival in the face of foreign invasions and existential threats, from Napoleon's ill-fated campaign to Hitler's brutal attempt to conquer the Soviet Union. To assume that a few NATO-backed missiles launched from Ukraine would intimidate Russia into surrendering is as ludicrous as it is dangerous. Are Western leaders so naive? Or are they simply parroting slogans crafted by powerful elites eager to see the world plunge into another global conflict? It is hard to imagine that those in power believe Russia would back down. After all, these are the same individuals who have built their narratives around the notion of a resolute Russia, willing to defend its interests with force. If anything, such an attack would only escalate tensions, pushing both NATO and Russia closer to the brink of war. What would happen after the strike? Let us consider for a moment what might happen if Ukraine, with NATO's support, managed to successfully hit Russian targets with these long-range missiles. Would Russia surrender to NATO, as some Western pundits seem to believe? The answer is clearly no. In fact, the opposite is far more likely. Russia would respond with overwhelming force. Putin's restraint thus far, not committing to a full-scale war, likely stems from his desire to avoid a global escalation and preserve the possibility of a peaceful resolution. However, a direct attack on Russian territory by NATO-backed forces would leave him with no choice but to retaliate in kind. A Russian counterattack would not be limited to conventional warfare. The risk of nuclear escalation would become very real, as Russia has repeatedly made clear that it views the defense of its homeland as a matter of existential importance. A long-range missile attack on Russia would be seen as a direct threat to its sovereignty, and under such circumstances, nuclear deterrence becomes a terrifying reality. In such a scenario, the consequences would be far-reaching, with the potential for a full-blown nuclear conflict that would devastate not only Europe but the entire world. NATO's fragility in the face of escalation. The idea that NATO could stand firm and protect Europe in the event of a Russian counterattack is questionable at best. NATO, often portrayed as the bedrock of European security, is more fragile than many realize. While it boasts military strength on paper, it is essentially a house of cards, a collection of nations with differing interests, often hesitant to engage in direct conflict. The alliance may talk tough, but in the face of a real military escalation, its unity would be put to the test. Europe's military capabilities are woefully insufficient to deal with a full-scale Russian assault. NATO's reliance on the United States for defense is a glaring vulnerability. Should the situation escalate to a nuclear level, it is doubtful that NATO, or even the US, could shield Europe from the fallout. The continent would become the battleground for a conflict between two nuclear-armed superpowers, with no real protection for its population. In the face of a nuclear exchange, NATO's elaborate defense systems would offer little more than a temporary delay before the inevitable destruction. Nuclear escalation, the ultimate consequence. The gravest consequence of a NATO-backed missile strike on Russia is the possibility of nuclear escalation. Both NATO and Russia possess vast nuclear arsenals capable of obliterating entire cities and rendering regions uninhabitable for generations. If a long-range missile attack on Russia were to provoke a nuclear response, the world could find itself on the edge of annihilation. A nuclear conflict would not leave any victors, only survivors. And even those fortunate enough to seek refuge in bunkers would face a grim reality once they emerged. The aftermath of a nuclear war would devastate ecosystems, collapse economies, and trigger global famine as radiation spreads across the planet. The global supply chains, already fragile from the recent pandemic and political tensions, would disintegrate, leaving billions of people without access to food, medicine, or clean water. Societies would unravel, and the survivors of the initial blasts would face the brutal challenge of survival in a post-apocalyptic world. Conclusion. The idea that a few long-range missiles could bring Russia to its knees reflects a dangerous misunderstanding of geopolitical realities. Far from forcing Russia into submission, such an attack would provoke a devastating retaliation, with the risk of nuclear escalation looming large. NATO's fragile unity and Europe's limited military capabilities would be unable to shield the continent from the consequences of such a conflict. The real danger lies not in the immediate effects of a missile strike, but in the chain reaction it would unleash. Russia, far from capitulating, would escalate the conflict, possibly to the point of nuclear war. Those advocating for such reckless actions must recognize that the outcome would not be a victorious NATO or a defeated Russia, but a world plunged into chaos, destruction, and the end of life as we know it. Politicians and media outlets pushing these dangerous narratives should reconsider the long-term consequences of the actions they propose. There may be no humans left to debate the next steps, apart from a few who survive in bunkers, only to face a desolate world.